I want to welcome everyone to the Senate Budget Committee today, particularly our witness, Congressional Budget Office Director Douglas Elmendorf. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for your good work. In today's hearing, we'll again focus on the economy and steps that can be taken to strengthen the recovery and create jobs. Last year, at my request, the Congressional Budget Office completed an analysis of the so-called bang for the buck achieved by different fiscal policy proposals. CBO has now updated that work, so we thought it would be useful to have Director Elmendorf here today to report on his agency's latest conclusions. I'm hopeful that Congress will consider CBO's analysis in developing any near-term economic growth measures that might be passed before the end of the year. I'd like to begin by briefly reviewing the economic situation now confronting the nation. It's clear that economic recovery that we are now experiencing is not what it should be or what we would like it to be. Here are some of the factors I believe that are holding back the economy. Unemployment remains stubbornly high. The housing crisis that helped spark the downturn is continuing. We have weak consumer confidence and weak consumer demand. Personal debt is still near record levels. Businesses and consumers still face tightened borrowing standards. State and local budget cutbacks are continuing to create a drag on job and economic growth. And our debt is also a challenge to future economic growth. Among these factors, the continuing housing crisis is particularly notable. If we look back at the 7 previous recoveries, we can see that a surging housing market was a driving force behind the return to economic growth. Housing starts rose dramatically in every one of those recoveries. But in this recovery, housing starts have remained low and continue to be. We know that some of the drag holding back the recovery is caused by the nature of the recession that preceded it. Economists have found that following recessions caused by or accompanied by a severe financial crisis, recoveries tend to be shallower and take much longer. 2 leading economists, Dr. Carmen Reinhart and Dr. Vincent Reinhart, found in their research, and I quote from their findings, real per capita GDP growth rates are significantly lower during the decade following severe financial crises. In the 10-year window following a severe financial crisis, unemployment rates are significantly higher than in the decade that preceded the crisis. The decade of relative prosperity prior to the fall was importantly fueled by an expansion in credit and rising leverage that spans about 10 years. It is followed by a lengthy period of retrenchment that most often only begins after the crisis and lasts almost as long as the credit surge. In other words, we could see a period of low growth and relatively high unemployment for some time because we are recovering from a severe financial crisis, the most severe since the Great Depression. If we look at private sector job growth, we see it has improved dramatically from where we were in the recession. In January of 2009, the economy lost more than 800,000 private sector jobs in 1 month. Private sector job growth returned in March of 2010, and we have now had 20 consecutive quarters of growth, or 20 consecutive months of growth. However, clearly we have to do better. We need considerably more job growth in order to fuel a stronger recovery. The unemployment rate remains far too high. As of October, the unemployment rate was still hovering at 9%. Although the recovery is not as strong as we would like, it is important to recognize our economic situation would be much worse if we had not had the federal response to the recession and the financial crisis, including both the Fed's monetary policy action and the fiscal policy actions taken by Congress and the administration. That federal response, I believe, pulled the economy back from the brink and likely prevented us from slipping into a depression. And it may have not been slipping into a depression. We may have gone head first into a depression. Two other leading economists, Dr. Mark Zandi, who was an advisor to the McCain presidential campaign, and Dr. Alan Blinder, former vice chairman at the Federal Reserve, completed a study last year that measured the impact of federal actions on shoring up the economy. Here is a key quote from their report. "We find that its effects on real GDP, jobs, and inflation are huge and probably averted what could have been called Depression 2.0. When all is said and done, the financial and fiscal policies will have cost taxpayers a substantial sum, but not nearly as much as most had feared and not nearly as much as if policymakers had not acted at all. If the comprehensive policy responses saved the economy from another depression, as we estimate, they were well worth their cost." This next chart shows Dr. Zandi and Dr. Blinder's estimate of the number of jobs we would have had without the federal response. It shows that we would have had 8.1 million fewer jobs in the second quarter of 2010 if we had not had the federal response. We see a similar picture in the unemployment rate. According to Dr. Zandi and Dr. Blinder's findings, if we had not had the federal response, the unemployment rate would have been 15% in the second quarter of 2010 and would have continued rising to 16.2% in the fourth quarter of 2010. Looking forward, it is clear there are further steps that can be taken to help shore up the recovery in the near term. CBO's analysis looks at some of these steps and determines which would provide the greatest bang for the buck in spurring economic growth and job creation. Here are CBO's key findings. On the upper end of the scale, it shows that policies like extending unemployment insurance and an employer payroll tax cut give you a higher impact on GDP for each dollar spent. On the bottom end of the scale, CBO once again found that extending the Bush-era tax cuts provide a much lower impact on GDP for each dollar spent. It also found that a repatriation tax holiday provides very little bang for the buck. I look forward to hearing more about these findings from Director Elmendorf. To be clear, there is nothing contradictory about pursuing near-term economic growth measures at the same time we pursue long-term debt reduction. We can and we must do both. We need to give a near-term boost to the recovery while simultaneously putting in place policies that will bring down deficit and debt over the long term. The deficit reduction can be phased in after the recovery is on a stronger footing, but it should be enacted into law now. I want to be very clear about this. On every group that I have served, whether it's the Fiscal Commission or the Group of Six, we adopted that basic strategy. And it is clear we must put into law now a long-term deficit reduction plan. I believe that would provide a significant boost in confidence in the markets as people see the government finally putting its fiscal house in order.